Nicholas Hayes was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the coffee that was cooling in his hands. The house was enveloped in a heavy silence, the kind that felt physically weighty, pressing on his chest and making his ears ring. Ever since they lost Sarah, his wife, this silence seemed to be the only thing left in the house. Ava, his 12-year-old daughter, no longer spoke to him as she used to. She was always locked away in her room, isolated, as if the world outside no longer made sense. He sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. His work as a criminal defense attorney distracted him, but every time he returned home, the reality of Sarah's absence hit him hard. He glanced at the clock. It was past 8 in the evening, and he hadn't heard Ava come down even once throughout the day. The food he had left on the lunch table remained untouched. She's getting worse, Nicholas thought, and the guilt that followed consumed him. He didn't know how to help his daughter. He barely knew how to help himself. Sarah's face still haunted him in dreams, that warm smile now a painful memory. He felt like he was failing, both as a father and as a human being. Suddenly, the sound of a door opening pulled him from his thoughts. Ava was coming down the stairs slowly, wearing the same pajamas she had for days. Her hair was unkempt, and her eyes were swollen from crying. Nicholas stood up, hesitantly. "Ava, do you want to have dinner? I can whip up something quick," he offered, trying to sound casual, but the anguish seeped through his voice. Ava didn't look him in the eye. She simply shook her head, not saying a word, and went straight to the living room. She flopped onto the couch, hugging a pillow while turning on the TV without really paying attention to what was on. Nicholas stood there for a few seconds, unsure of what to do. Their conversations were becoming increasingly rare, and when they did happen, they were shallow, cold. He felt like he was losing Ava little by little, just as he had lost Sarah, but in a different, more painful way. Because Ava was still there, breathing, living, but it was as if she had gone to a distant, unreachable place. He walked over to the couch, sitting down at the other end. He wanted to touch her, to say something that would break the invisible barrier that seemed to separate them, but he couldn't find the words. "Ava," he began, but she interrupted him. "I'll be fine, Dad," she said, not taking her eyes off the screen. Her voice was monotone, as if she were merely fulfilling the formality of reassuring him. Nicholas knew it was a lie. Neither of them was okay, but he didn't know how to fix it. The void that Sarah had left seemed to grow larger with each passing day, and Ava was sinking into that void faster than he could hold on to her. He got up and walked to the window, gazing out at the dark night. The moon was hidden behind the clouds, which seemed fitting considering the darkness that engulfed their lives. As he looked outside, he knew something had to change. He needed to find a way to help his daughter before it was too late. And then, like a distant echo, he remembered a conversation he had earlier in the day at the office. A suggestion he had dismissed at the time, but now it made more sense. Sophie, maybe she could help. The next morning, Nicholas sat at his desk, flipping through a pile of case files, but his mind was somewhere else. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness that had settled over him. Ava's face lingered in his thoughts, her distant eyes, her cold responses. She was slipping away from him, and the weight of that realization felt unbearable. A soft knock on his office door snapped him back to the present. It was Christine, one of his colleagues, carrying her usual stack of paperwork. "You look like you didn't sleep," she said, offering a small, knowing smile as she entered the room. Nicholas gave her a half-hearted nod. "Not much." Christine set the papers down on his desk and studied him for a moment. They had worked together for years, long enough for her to read the unspoken signs. "How's Ava holding up?" He sighed deeply, leaning back in his chair. "Not well. Honestly, I don't know what to do anymore. She's barely eating, barely talking. It's like she's not even there." His voice cracked, betraying the frustration and grief he had been trying to hold inside. Christine sat down across from him, her face softening with concern. "It's been, what, almost a year since Sarah passed?" Nicholas nodded, his jaw tightening at the mention of his late wife. Even now, the pain of her absence felt as raw as the day they had lost her. "Have you thought about getting help for Ava?" Christine asked gently. You're doing your best, Nicholas. But maybe it's time to bring in someone who can help her process all of this. Someone she can talk to? Nicholas rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of Christine's words settle over him. He hated admitting that he wasn't enough, that despite his best efforts, Ava needed more than what he could give. But the truth was undeniable. His daughter was drowning in her grief, and he was too close, too shattered by his own loss, to pull her out. "I've thought about it," he said quietly, though the words felt like a lie. He hadn't really considered it, not seriously at least, but I wouldn't even know where to start. A therapist? A counselor? Christine hesitated for a moment, as if weighing her next words carefully. "There's someone I know who might be able to help. She's not a professional therapist, but she's special, compassionate, empathetic. Someone who understands trauma." She paused, watching his reaction closely. "Her name is Sophie." Nicholas's brow furrowed in confusion. The name was familiar, tugging at the back of his memory, but he couldn't quite place it. "Sophie? She's been through a lot herself," Christine continued, ignoring his puzzled expression. "But she has this way with people, especially kids who are going through tough times. I think she could really connect with Ava." Nicholas leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "How do you know her?" Christine's expression shifted slightly, becoming more cautious. "I've worked with her, indirectly. You actually helped her once, years ago." His mind raced back, searching for the connection. Then it hit him. Sophie, the young girl from that harrowing case nearly 5 years ago. She had been caught in a legal battle that threatened to rip her life apart, and Nicholas had been her defense attorney, fighting to free her from a system that had failed her. She had been an orphan, alone and vulnerable, but strong in ways that had struck him even back then. He blinked, processing this. "Sophie, the girl from the adoption case? You think she could help Ava?" Christine nodded, her gaze steady. "She's different now, Nicholas. Life has toughened her, but it's also given her the ability to empathize with people in ways most of us can't. She's been through more than most, and I think that's why she might be able to reach Ava, because she understands loss on a deep level." Nicholas hesitated, the thought swirling in his mind. He had no doubt Sophie had grown into an extraordinary woman. He remembered the fierce will she had shown as a girl. But entrusting his daughter's fragile heart to someone from his past, someone he barely knew anymore, it felt risky. But then again, wasn't everything about this situation risky? If he did nothing, he was risking losing Ava forever. Christine saw the conflict in his eyes and pressed on, gently but firmly. "You can't keep doing this alone, Nicholas. Ava needs help, and so do you." Those words hit him harder than he expected. He had been so focused on saving Ava, he hadn't considered how much he, too, had been drowning. Maybe that's why he hadn't been able to help her, because he was too broken to see it clearly. After a long moment, Nicholas exhaled deeply, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly. "Okay," he said finally. "I'll talk to her." Later that evening, Nicholas sat at the kitchen table, staring at his phone. Sophie's number was in his hand, but he couldn't bring himself to dial just yet. His mind wandered back to the courtroom all those years ago. The sight of Sophie sitting quietly in the corner, her small frame dwarfed by the harshness of the legal system. He remembered how she had looked at him when the verdict had been read. Her eyes filled with something like gratitude, or maybe hope. Was he pinning too much hope on this? What if she couldn't help Ava? What if seeing her only dredged up more pain for both of them? But the image of Ava's pale, lifeless face flashed in his mind, and before he could second-guess himself, his fingers dialed the number. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Sophie speaking." Nicholas froze for a moment, surprised at how different yet familiar she sounded. "Sophie, it's Nicholas Hayes. I don't know if you remember me, but I remember you," she said softly, her tone filled with warmth. "How could I forget?" There was a long silence between them, filled with the weight of unspoken things. "I need your help," Nicholas said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's my daughter, Ava. She's not coping well after losing her mother, and I don't know what to do anymore." Sophie was quiet for a moment, but when she spoke again, her voice was steady and sure. I'll come by tomorrow. We'll figure it out together. Nicholas hung up the phone, his chest tightening with a mixture of relief and fear. He didn't know if this was the right decision, but it was the only one he had left. As he walked toward Ava's room to check on her, a small flicker of hope ignited within him. It wasn't much, but it was something to hold on to. Maybe, just maybe, Sophie could help them find a way out of the darkness. The next morning came too quickly. Nicholas found himself pacing the living room, his nerves fraying with each step. He had barely slept the night before, his mind consumed with doubts about his decision. Ava was still upstairs, probably still in bed, withdrawn into the shell she had built around herself. Nicholas knew today was important. Sophie was coming, and somehow, it felt like everything depended on this moment. He glanced at the clock. Sophie was due to arrive any minute now. His heart pounded in his chest, a mixture of anxiety and anticipation swirling within him. He hadn't told Ava yet. Part of him was afraid she would resist, retreat further into herself if she knew a stranger was coming to help. Another part of him, the part that was desperate, hoped that Sophie's presence might break through the walls Ava had built. A sharp knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. He froze for a second, then quickly made his way over. As he opened the door, a gust of cool morning air swept into the room, and there she was, Sophie. The years had changed her, but Nicholas recognized her immediately. Her auburn hair was shorter now, neatly tucked behind her ears, and her eyes, those same sharp, perceptive eyes, held a quiet strength, the kind that spoke of someone who had faced down her own demons. She smiled softly, a smile that didn't try too hard, just enough to let him know she was there. "Nicholas," she greeted, her voice calm but warm, a stark contrast to the turbulence he felt inside. "Sophie." He stepped aside, motioning for her to come in. "Thanks for coming." She nodded, walking in with a quiet confidence that seemed to ease some of the tension in the air. As she entered, Nicholas couldn't help but feel a strange sense of familiarity, as if she belonged here, in this space, despite the years that had passed. "It's been a while," Sophie said, glancing around the room, her eyes briefly settling on the family photos that still hung on the walls. The sight of Sarah's smiling face in one of the frames caused a flicker of something unreadable in her expression, but she quickly looked back at Nicholas. "How have you been holding up?" Nicholas exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Not well," he admitted. "It's been hard. Harder than I thought it would be." Sophie gave a small nod of understanding. "I'm sorry for your loss, Nicholas. I can't imagine what it's been like for you and Ava." There was a long pause between them, the weight of unspoken grief filling the room. Then, with a deep breath, Nicholas forced himself to move forward. "I haven't told Ava yet," he confessed, rubbing the back of his neck. "She doesn't know you're coming. I didn't know how to bring it up." Sophie tilted her head slightly, considering his words. "How's she been? Since?" Nicholas felt his throat tighten at the thought of Ava. "She's distant. I barely recognize her some days. She doesn't talk to me. She doesn't eat much. It's like she's somewhere else, somewhere I can't reach." Sophie's gaze softened, her empathy palpable. "That's normal, Nicholas. Grief, it pulls you into places you don't even realize you're going. Ava's in one of those places, but she's not lost. She just needs time, and someone to meet her where she is." Nicholas nodded, though uncertainty still clouded his mind. "I hope you can reach her," he said, his voice low. "Because I can't." Before Sophie could respond, they heard the soft creak of the stairs. Nicholas turned, his heart skipping a beat. Ava stood at the top, her face pale, her eyes barely registering the scene below. She seemed smaller somehow, more fragile than ever. She didn't say a word, just watched, her gaze moving slowly from her father to Sophie. Sophie was the first to break the silence, her voice gentle but deliberate. "Hi, Ava," she said, offering a small smile. "I'm Sophie." Ava's eyes flicked to Nicholas, suspicion creeping into her expression. "Who is she?" she asked, her voice flat, emotionless. Nicholas took a step forward, keeping his tone as steady as he could. "Sophie's here to help, sweetheart. I thought you might want to talk to someone." Ava's face tightened, her body stiffening defensively. I don't need help. The rejection stung, but Nicholas had expected it. He shot a desperate look at Sophie, silently pleading for her to do something, anything to make this better. Sophie, however, didn't push. She simply stood there, her demeanor calm, letting the silence stretch just long enough to ease the tension. That's okay, Sophie said after a moment. I'm not here to force you into anything. I just wanted to meet you, see how you're doing. We don't have to talk if you don't want to. Ava's eyes narrowed, clearly not trusting the situation, but there was something in Sophie's tone, an absence of pressure, of expectations, that seemed to catch her off guard. She hesitated at the top of the stairs, her fingers gripping the railing, unsure of how to react. Sensing the fragile ground they stood on, Sophie kept her approach soft. I've been through some tough stuff myself, she said, her voice lowering just a fraction. Not the same as you, but I know what it's like to feel lost, like the world doesn't make sense anymore. Ava didn't respond, but she didn't turn away either. Her gaze lingered on Sophie, a flicker of something, curiosity, maybe, breaking through the coldness in her eyes. Nicholas held his breath, watching the exchange, hoping, praying that something would shift. After what felt like an eternity, Ava finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. You don't know anything about me. Sophie smiled gently. You're right. I don't. But I'd like to if you'd let me. Ava's defenses went up again, but this time, they weren't as impenetrable as before. I don't need anyone, she muttered, turning on her heel and retreating back up the stairs. Nicholas's heart sank, his shoulders slumping in defeat. He had hoped for more, for something to change, but Ava was still locked away, refusing to let anyone in. He glanced at Sophie, expecting to see the same disappointment on her face. But instead, Sophie's expression remained calm, almost serene. It's a start, she said softly, as if sensing Nicholas's despair. She didn't slam the door. That's something. Nicholas wanted to believe her, but doubt gnawed at him. She's just so closed off. I don't know how you'll get through to her. Sophie turned to him, her eyes steady and full of quiet determination. We'll take it one step at a time, she said firmly. I'm not going anywhere, Nicholas. We'll figure this out. As they stood there, the tension in the room slowly dissipating, Nicholas felt a small flicker of hope return. Sophie was right. Ava hadn't slammed the door. It wasn't much, but it was more than they had before. And in the heavy silence that followed, Nicholas clung to that small, fragile hope, knowing that it might just be the lifeline they needed to pull Ava back from the brink. Sophie began coming by regularly after that first meeting. Nicholas watched with cautious hope as Ava's initial resistance softened, ever so slightly, with each visit. It wasn't immediate, but slowly, Sophie's presence became less of an intrusion and more of a familiar, almost comforting routine. One evening, about a week after Sophie had started visiting, Nicholas sat at the kitchen table, scrolling absent-mindedly through case files, when he heard something that made him freeze. A sound that had become so rare in the house, it almost felt foreign. Laughter. It was faint, coming from the living room, but it was unmistakable. Ava was laughing. Nicholas's heart raced. He stood up, walking quietly toward the source of the sound, not wanting to break whatever spell had been cast. As he approached the doorway, he saw them, Ava and Sophie, sitting on the floor, surrounded by art supplies. There were paints, brushes, and paper scattered around them, and Ava was in the middle of telling a story, her eyes brighter than he had seen in months. Sophie sat cross-legged beside her, her hands stained with paint, listening intently as Ava spoke. She wasn't forcing anything, wasn't prying into the deeper emotions that Ava was still too afraid to confront. Instead, they talked about simple things. The colors they liked, the way the paint felt as it brushed across the paper. I always liked blue, Ava said, dipping her brush into a deep shade of azure. It's peaceful. Sophie smiled, her eyes following Ava's brushstrokes. Blue is a good color, she agreed. I always thought it felt like the ocean. Calm on the surface, but full of hidden depths. Ava nodded, as if she understood that more than Sophie could know. Nicholas stayed in the doorway, hidden from their view, watching in awe. It was the first time in what felt like forever that Ava looked alive. Her movements were more fluid, her voice more animated, and the dark cloud that had hung over her since Sarah's death seemed to have lifted, even if just for a moment. "Do you think my mom liked blue?" Ava asked suddenly, her voice softer now, her eyes still on the paper. Sophie paused for a second, as if considering her response carefully. "I don't know, Ava," she said gently, "but if she was anything like you, I'm sure she loved it." Ava's hand hesitated over the canvas, and for a split second, Nicholas thought she might shut down again, retreat back into the silence that had defined her for so long. But then she nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement, and continued painting. Nicholas felt his chest tighten with a surge of emotion. He had forgotten what it was like to see Ava engaged in something, to hear her ask questions, to see her create. For so long, she had been stuck in a fog of grief, and now, for the first time in months, he saw a glimpse of the little girl she used to be. Unable to watch any longer without being noticed, Nicholas quietly retreated back to the kitchen, his heart pounding. He sat down, his mind racing, trying to process what he had just witnessed. There was still so much work to be done, still so much healing that needed to happen. But this was hope. Real, tangible hope. And it was all because of Sophie. The next few weeks saw more small victories, each one building on the last. Ava, who had once locked herself away in her room for days, began spending more time downstairs. She'd sit at the table while Sophie painted with her, or they'd talk about things that had nothing to do with grief or loss. Books, movies, dreams about the future. Sophie had a way of making Ava feel safe, of giving her space to be herself without the weight of expectation. She didn't push her to talk about Sarah, didn't force her to confront the pain head-on. Instead, she let Ava open up in her own time, at her own pace. One afternoon, Nicholas came home from work earlier than usual. As he walked through the door, the familiar sound of quiet conversation greeted him. He found Sophie and Ava sitting at the dining table, their heads bent over a board game. There was an ease between them now, a natural flow to their interactions that hadn't been there before. Ava's face lit up as she moved her piece across the board, and Nicholas couldn't help but smile at the sight. It was as if Sophie had breathed life back into his daughter, coaxing out the joy that had been buried beneath the grief. "Dad," Ava called out when she noticed him standing by the doorway. "We're playing Monopoly. Do you want to join?" The invitation took him by surprise. It had been so long since Ava had included him in anything that, for a moment, he didn't know how to respond. But then he smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest, and walked over to the table. "Sure," he said, pulling up a chair beside them. "But you know, I'm pretty ruthless when it comes to Monopoly." Ava rolled her eyes playfully, a grin tugging at her lips. "We'll see about that." For the next hour, they played, laughing and teasing each other as the game went on. Nicholas couldn't remember the last time he had felt this way. So connected to Ava. So normal. It was as if, for that brief period, the darkness that had shrouded their home had lifted, replaced by something lighter, something that felt almost like happiness. Sophie watched quietly from her spot at the table, a soft smile on her face as she observed father and daughter reconnecting. She had never forced her presence into their lives, but in that moment, Nicholas realized just how much she had given them. She had given him back his daughter, little by little, piece by piece. Later that night, after Sophie had left and Ava had gone to bed, Nicholas sat alone in the living room, the weight of everything finally catching up to him. The house was quiet again, but this time, the silence wasn't suffocating. It was peaceful, filled with the lingering warmth of laughter and connection. He found himself thinking about Sophie, how easily she had fit into their lives, how naturally she had bonded with Ava. There was something about her that felt almost familiar, in a way he couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just because of their past, of the case that had connected them all those years ago. It was something deeper, something he couldn't shake. Nicholas leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. There were moments when Sophie reminded him of someone he had known long ago, before Sarah, before his life had taken the turns it had. But it was impossible. He was imagining things, looking for connections that weren't there. Still, the thought lingered. And as he drifted off to sleep that night, one question echoed in the back of his mind. Who exactly was Sophie? Days turned into weeks, and the transformation in Ava was undeniable. She was smiling more, speaking more openly, and even taking part in small, everyday activities that she had once avoided. It was as though Sophie had unlocked something in her, something that had been buried beneath layers of grief. The house, once suffocating with silence, was now filled with the sound of life again. Nicholas should have felt nothing but relief, gratitude even, and yet a nagging feeling had begun to settle in his mind, a sense that there was something about Sophie he was missing. One evening, after Ava had gone to bed, Nicholas sat in his study, flipping through some old case files. It had become a routine for him, working late into the night, trying to keep his mind occupied to avoid overthinking. But tonight, he couldn't focus. His thoughts kept drifting back to Sophie. Something about her didn't quite add up. It wasn't anything specific. In fact, she had been nothing but kind, patient, and exactly what Ava needed. But the more time Nicholas spent around her, the more he felt unsettled. It was the way she looked at him sometimes, the way she seemed to know just what to say, just how to handle every delicate situation with Ava. It wasn't just skill. It was almost as if she knew them, on a level deeper than mere observation. Nicholas leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He couldn't shake the feeling that Sophie was hiding something. But what? Why would she? His eyes drifted to the corner of his desk, where an old case file lay half open. It was Sophie's file, the case from years ago when she was just a teenager, scared and alone, fighting for a second chance at life. He remembered every detail of that case. He had fought hard for her, believed in her when no one else did. But now, years later, there were gaps in his memory. Things about her life, her past, that he hadn't bothered to question at the time. He opened the file, scanning through the pages. Her birth date, her background, the foster homes, the legal battles, the heartbreak she had endured. But something about the details felt too vague. For a girl who had gone through so much, there was an odd lack of depth in her file. It was as though parts of her life had been deliberately left out. Nicholas's pulse quickened as his curiosity deepened. He felt an urge to dig deeper, to understand who Sophie really was. But why? What was he hoping to find? He didn't have an answer, but the nagging feeling refused to go away. The next day, as Sophie and Ava painted together in the living room, Nicholas found himself watching them from the kitchen. He saw the way Sophie interacted with Ava, so gentle, so attentive, and yet, there was something in her eyes, something that flickered whenever she looked at him. A kind of recognition that didn't make sense. Later, as they sat down for dinner, Sophie casually mentioned a memory from her childhood, something about a trip to the beach. Nicholas nodded politely, but the more she spoke, the more he realized there was something disturbingly familiar about her story. He had heard it before. Not the exact words, but something strikingly similar from someone else. Someone from his past. That night, after Sophie left, Nicholas lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. His mind was racing with fragments of memories, old conversations, and half-formed thoughts. He kept coming back to one person, someone he hadn't thought about in years. Isabella. Isabella had been his first love, long before Sarah, long before life had taken him down the path that led him here. Their relationship had been brief, a whirlwind romance that ended just as suddenly as it began. She had disappeared from his life almost as quickly as she had entered it, leaving him with nothing but memories, and, as he later discovered, a child she had never told him about. Nicholas sat up in bed, his heart pounding in his chest. Could it be? Could Sophie be connected to that part of his past? The idea seemed ridiculous, and yet, the more he thought about it, the more the pieces began to fall into place. The next day, Nicholas couldn't shake the thought from his mind. He found himself replaying every interaction with Sophie, every story she had told, every look she had given him. There was something more than coincidence at play here. He was sure of it. Determined to get to the bottom of it, he decided to do something he hadn't done in years: revisit the details of Isabella's life. He went to his office and pulled out the dusty file from the back of the cabinet, the one that held the sparse details of his brief time with her. As he flipped through the pages, His heart nearly stopped. There, buried among the medical records, was a hospital report. It listed the birth of a child, a daughter, born around the same time Sophie had been adopted. His hands shook as he stared at the document, the realization hitting him like a wave. Sophie wasn't just someone he had helped. She wasn't just a girl he had defended in court. She was his daughter, his biological daughter. Nicholas felt the room spin as the weight of the discovery settled over him. How had he not seen it before? The familiarity, the connection he had felt from the moment he met her. It all made sense now. Sophie was his child, the one Isabella had kept from him all those years ago. He sank into his chair, his mind swirling with questions. Did Sophie know? Had she come into their lives knowing the truth? Or was this all just a coincidence? A cruel twist of fate that had brought them together without either of them knowing. Nicholas felt sick to his stomach. The truth was too much to process. He had a daughter he had never known about, and now she was here, in his home, helping to heal the wounds of his other child. But there was a darker question gnawing at the back of his mind. A question he didn't want to confront, but couldn't ignore. Why had Sophie come back into his life? And what would happen now that he knew the truth? As he sat in the quiet of his study, the revelation sinking in, Nicholas realized there was no turning back. The seeds of doubt had grown into something much larger. He would have to confront Sophie, and when he did, everything would change. Nicholas could hardly breathe. The revelation had hit him with the force of a tidal wave, sweeping away every certainty he had held on to. Sophie, this kind, empathetic woman who had breathed life back into Ava, was his daughter, his biological daughter. The file on his desk lay open, the pieces of his past now laid bare before him. Every detail, every memory from years ago that had seemed foggy and distant was now as clear as day. He stood up from his desk, his legs shaky beneath him, and walked to the window, trying to steady his racing heart. Outside, the world went on as usual, cars moving down the street, people walking their dogs, kids playing. But for Nicholas, everything had changed. His world had just been turned upside down. How had he not seen it sooner? The way Sophie looked at him sometimes, the subtle familiarity in her voice, the unspoken connection between them. It all made sense now. She wasn't just someone from his past. She was a part of him. But if this was true, it raised even more disturbing questions. Did Sophie know? Had she come into his life with the knowledge that he was her father? And if so, why hadn't she said anything? Why had she allowed this secret to fester in the shadows, all while helping him heal Ava? Nicholas felt sick. His stomach twisted into knots as the weight of the truth bore down on him. He had lost so many years. Years he should have spent raising Sophie, knowing her, being her father. Instead, he had been kept in the dark, completely unaware that the daughter he never knew he had was right in front of him. He glanced at the clock. It was almost time for Sophie's next visit. The thought of facing her now, knowing what he knew, felt unbearable. But there was no avoiding it. He had to confront her. He had to know if she had been hiding the truth from him all this time. When Sophie arrived later that afternoon, Nicholas was waiting for her in the living room, his heart pounding in his chest. Ava was upstairs, working on a school project, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing downstairs. Sophie entered with her usual calm energy, her smile warm and inviting as she stepped through the door. "Hey," she greeted, setting down her bag of art supplies. "How's Ava today?" Nicholas couldn't bring himself to respond right away. His throat felt tight, his mind buzzing with the questions he was desperate to ask. Sophie noticed his hesitation, her brow furrowing slightly. "Is everything okay?" He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. This wasn't going to be easy. "We need to talk, Sophie," he said, his voice lower than usual, heavy with the weight of what he was about to say. Sophie's smile faltered, her eyes scanning his face. "What's going on?" she asked, her tone cautious, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. Nicholas gestured for her to sit down, and after a brief hesitation, she complied. He sat across from her, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. For a long moment, he couldn't find the words. How do you begin to tell someone that you've discovered they're your child? How do you even begin to untangle the web of lies and secrets that had brought them to this moment? Finally, he spoke, his voice strained. I found something. Something from my past. Sophie's expression remained calm, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps. What do you mean? Nicholas took another breath, steeling himself for what was coming. I was looking through some old files, legal cases from years ago, and I came across your file from the case when you were adopted. He watched her carefully, searching for any sign of recognition, any indication that she knew where this was going. It made me start thinking about the past, about things I've lost. Sophie sat still, her gaze steady but unreadable. Nicholas, what are you trying to say? The tension in the room was unbearable, the air thick with unspoken truths. Nicholas felt his heart hammering in his chest as he finally let the words spill out. Sophie, I think you're my daughter. The silence that followed was deafening. Sophie's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. She just stared at him, her face a mask of shock and disbelief. What? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Nicholas leaned forward, his voice urgent now. I found the records, Sophie. I know that your mother was Isabella, the woman I loved years ago. I didn't know she had a child. I didn't know about you. His voice broke slightly, the pain of the lost years washing over him. But you're mine. I know it. Sophie's face drained of color. She stood up abruptly, backing away from him, her hands shaking. No, that's not possible. Nicholas rose to his feet, his heart aching as he watched her struggle to process the truth. Sophie, please, listen to me. I know this is a lot. I know it's overwhelming. But you have to understand, I had no idea. I didn't know until now. She shook her head, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. You're wrong. You can't be my father. You don't know what you're talking about. Nicholas took a step toward her, his voice softening. Sophie, please, look at me. You felt it too, haven't you? That connection between us, it's not just in my head. You've known something was there. Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes as she stared at him, her body trembling. I didn't know, she whispered, her voice cracking. I didn't know who you were. I didn't know about any of this. Nicholas's heart shattered at the sight of her pain. He wanted to reach out to her, to comfort her, but he knew the wounds were too fresh, too raw. I'm sorry, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm so sorry, Sophie. I should have been there for you. I should have known. Sophie turned away, her hands covering her face as she fought back sobs. Nicholas stood there, helpless, unsure of what to do. This wasn't how he had imagined this moment. He had hoped for some kind of connection, some understanding that would bring them together. But all he could see now was the hurt in Sophie's eyes, the betrayal she felt at learning the truth in this way. I need to go, Sophie said suddenly, her voice trembling as she gathered her things. I can't deal with this right now. Nicholas felt his chest tighten. Sophie, please wait. But she was already at the door, her hand on the handle, her back to him. I need time, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I need to figure this out. And before Nicholas could say another word, she was gone. The door clicked shut, leaving Nicholas standing alone in the middle of the room, his heart heavy with the weight of everything that had just unfolded. He had found his daughter, only to lose her again in the span of a few minutes. The truth, once revealed, had fractured the fragile bond they had built. As the silence of the empty house closed in around him, Nicholas realized that nothing would ever be the same again. The devastating truth had come to light, and now, all he could do was wait. Wait and hope that, somehow, they could find a way to heal. But in that moment, as he stood there in the quiet, all he felt was the crushing weight of what had been lost. In the days that followed, Nicholas couldn't shake the crushing weight of guilt. The revelation that Sophie was his daughter had shaken him to his core, and now, the consequences of that truth loomed over him like a dark cloud. He had driven her away. After years of not knowing she existed, he had finally found her, only to lose her again within moments of their devastating confrontation. Each day that passed without hearing from Sophie felt like another layer of guilt being piled on his shoulders. He wanted to reach out, to explain himself, to beg for her forgiveness. But he knew she needed space. The shock of finding out the man she had come to trust was her father. It was too much to ask her to process all at once. Nicholas had begun distancing himself from both Sophie and Ava. He felt like a fraud, a father who had failed twice. Every time Ava looked at him with that trust she had begun to rebuild, it tore at him. How could he be the father she needed when he had failed to be a father to Sophie? The guilt was paralyzing, suffocating, and with each passing day, it became harder to face the reality of his life. One evening, about a week after Sophie had left, Nicholas found himself sitting in the darkened living room, nursing a glass of whiskey. The house was quiet again, but this time, it wasn't the peaceful quiet of Ava's laughter filling the rooms. It was the old silence, heavy, oppressive, suffocating. The same silence that had enveloped the house after Sarah's death. Ava walked into the room, her face etched with concern. She had noticed the change in him, the way he had retreated into himself, but Nicholas had been avoiding her questions, brushing off her attempts to connect. "Dad," she said quietly, sitting down next to him on the couch. "What's going on? You've been different." Nicholas stared into his glass, swirling the amber liquid but saying nothing. How could he explain to her what had happened? How could he tell Ava that the woman who had helped save her was her sister? It was a truth so tangled in guilt and pain that he didn't know where to begin. Ava's voice softened, her eyes filled with worry. "Is it Sophie?" At the sound of her name, Nicholas winced. He hadn't said a word to Ava about Sophie since the day she had walked out of the house. He couldn't. The guilt was too raw, too fresh. "She hasn't been around lately," Ava continued, her voice a mix of confusion and hurt. "Did something happen?" Nicholas looked at his daughter, his heart breaking. She had grown so attached to Sophie, had begun to rely on her in ways that had helped heal the wounds of Sarah's loss. But now, Sophie was gone, and Nicholas had no idea if or when she would come back. He set his glass down, rubbing his face with his hands, trying to find the words. "Ava, there's something I need to tell you," he began, his voice strained. "Something about Sophie." Ava's expression shifted, her brow furrowing in concern. "What is it?" Nicholas took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the confession settle over him. "Sophie, she's my daughter. She's your sister." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. Ava's eyes widened in shock, her face paling as she tried to process what she had just heard. "What?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Nicholas nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I didn't know, Ava. I swear to you, I didn't know until recently. I found out, and I confronted her about it." Ava stared at him, disbelief and confusion warring on her face. "How is that even possible? Why didn't she say anything? Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't tell you because I didn't know how," Nicholas admitted, his voice cracking. "I didn't want to hurt you, and I didn't want to lose Sophie. But now, I think I've lost both of you." Ava shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "Sophie's my sister? All this time, she's been my sister, and none of us knew?" Nicholas reached out to take her hand, but Ava pulled away, her hurt evident. "Why didn't she tell us?" she asked again, her voice trembling. "I don't know, Ava," Nicholas said softly. "I don't know if she even knew the truth when she came here. But now everything is out in the open, and I don't know how to fix it." Ava stood up, pacing the room, her hands trembling. "You should have told me," she said, her voice growing stronger. "You should have told me the minute you found out." "I know," Nicholas whispered, feeling the crushing weight of his guilt. "I'm sorry, Ava. I didn't handle this the way I should have." For a long moment, Ava didn't say anything. She just stood there, her back to him, her shoulders tense with emotion. Nicholas could see the storm brewing inside her, the mix of confusion, betrayal, and hurt that mirrored his own. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think she'll come back?" Nicholas didn't have an answer. He wanted to believe that Sophie would return, that they could find a way to heal from this devastating truth. But the look in her eyes when she had left, he wasn't sure if she could forgive him, or if she even wanted to. "I don't know," he said, his voice heavy with sorrow. I hope so. Ava turned to face him, her eyes filled with tears. I miss her, Dad. She was helping me. I don't know what I'll do if she doesn't come back. Nicholas's heart ached as he listened to his daughter's words. Sophie had been more than just a friend to Ava. She had been a lifeline, someone who had helped pull her out of the darkness. And now, that lifeline had been severed. I miss her too, Nicholas said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. They sat in silence for a long time, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on them both. The house felt emptier than ever, the absence of Sophie a painful reminder of all they had lost. The days passed slowly after that, each one marked by a growing distance between Nicholas and Ava. He tried to be there for her, but the weight of his guilt made it impossible to connect. He felt like he had failed both of his daughters, Ava, who had needed him to be strong, and Sophie, who had needed him to be honest. And Sophie, she was gone. He had no idea where she was, or if she would ever come back. The thought of losing her again, after everything they had been through, was almost too much to bear. Nicholas found himself replaying their last conversation over and over in his mind, wondering if there had been something he could have said to make her stay. But no matter how many times he went over it, the result was always the same. Sophie had left, and he didn't know if she would ever return. One evening, as Nicholas sat alone in his study, he heard a knock on the front door. His heart leapt, hope surging through him. Could it be Sophie? But when he opened the door, it wasn't Sophie standing there. It was Ava. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. She looked at him for a long moment, and then, without a word, she stepped inside and wrapped her arms around him, holding on as though she was afraid to let go. I don't want to lose her, she whispered, her voice breaking. Nicholas held her tightly, his own tears threatening to spill over. Neither do I, he whispered back. And in that moment, as they stood together in the quiet house, Nicholas realized that while they had lost so much, they still had each other. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to bring Sophie back. If only she could find her way home. It had been almost 2 weeks since Sophie walked out of Nicholas's house, leaving behind an unbearable silence that weighed heavily on him and Ava. The days stretched on with no word from her, no sign of whether she'd ever come back. Nicholas tried to reach out, but each call went unanswered, each message left without a reply. He felt as though he was sinking deeper into a void, one that threatened to pull both him and Ava under. Ava had grown quieter again, retreating into herself, and Nicholas knew it was because Sophie's absence hurt her deeply. Sophie had been more than just a friend. She had become family to Ava, even before the truth was known. And now, with that bond shattered, Nicholas felt like he was failing her all over again. One evening, after yet another day of strained silence, the doorbell rang. Nicholas, expecting nothing more than a package or perhaps a neighbor, opened the door with a heavy heart. But when he saw who was standing there, the breath caught in his throat. It was Sophie. She looked different, as though the weight of the truth had etched itself into her face. Her usual calm expression was replaced by one of hesitation and uncertainty, her eyes shadowed with emotion she could no longer hide. Sophie, Nicholas breathed, both relieved and terrified to see her again. He stepped aside, motioning for her to come in, but Sophie didn't move right away. She stood there, her eyes locked on his, the tension between them thick and painful. I didn't know if I should come back, she said quietly, her voice barely audible. But I couldn't stay away. Nicholas felt a surge of emotion, guilt, hope, fear, all swirling together as he struggled to find the right words. I'm glad you did, he said, his voice heavy with sincerity. I've been waiting, hoping you'd come. Sophie stepped inside, her movements slow, as if she wasn't quite sure she belonged there anymore. She stood in the living room, the room where so many memories had been made, the same room where the truth had shattered everything. Ava appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide with shock as she saw Sophie standing there. Sophie? Her voice was small, vulnerable, as if she was afraid this moment wasn't real. Sophie's eyes softened when she saw Ava, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly. Hey, Ava. Ava didn't move for a moment, as though she wasn't sure what to do. But then, all at once, She crossed the room and threw her arms around Sophie, hugging her tightly. Sophie hesitated for a second, but then wrapped her arms around Ava, holding her close. "I thought you were never coming back," Ava whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. Sophie's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she held onto her. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice cracking. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I needed time." Ava pulled back slightly, looking up at Sophie with wide, questioning eyes. "Why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you say you were our family?" Sophie's expression crumbled at the question, and she took a deep breath before answering. "Because I didn't know," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I didn't know when I first came here. I didn't know Nicholas was my father. I thought I was just coming to help. But then, as I spent more time here, things started to feel familiar. I didn't understand it at first, but then I started remembering things, small details about my past. And when I finally looked into it, I realized the truth." Nicholas, who had been standing quietly nearby, finally spoke, his voice filled with emotion. "Why didn't you say something when you found out?" Sophie turned to him, her face filled with a mixture of pain and confusion. "Because I didn't know how. How do you tell someone that you're the daughter they never knew they had? How do you even begin to explain something like that?" Nicholas took a step closer, his heart aching at the sight of her pain. "Sophie, I would have understood. I wouldn't have been angry. I would have been grateful. You didn't have to carry that alone." Sophie shook her head, tears spilling over now. "I wasn't ready. I've spent my whole life not knowing where I came from, not knowing why I was given up. And then, to find out like this, it felt like everything I thought I knew was a lie." Nicholas felt the guilt surge up inside him, raw and overwhelming. "I didn't know about you, Sophie," he said, his voice breaking. "If I had known, God, I would have done anything to find you. But I didn't know. And I'm so sorry for that." Sophie looked at him, her face filled with the vulnerability of someone who had carried far too much pain for far too long. "I don't know how to deal with this, Nicholas. I don't know how to be your daughter. I don't know how to be a sister to Ava. I don't know how to just move forward from here." Ava stepped closer, her voice soft but filled with determination. "You don't have to figure it all out right away. You don't have to be anything you're not ready to be. But you're already family, Sophie. You were family long before we knew the truth." Sophie's gaze flicked between Ava and Nicholas, her tears falling freely now. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered again. Nicholas stepped closer, his own voice thick with emotion. "We'll figure it out. Together." There was a long silence as Sophie stood there, her tears still flowing, but her defenses crumbling. For so long, she had carried the weight of being alone, of not knowing where she belonged. But here, in this room with Nicholas and Ava, she realized something she hadn't allowed herself to believe until now. She wasn't alone anymore. Sophie nodded slowly, her walls finally coming down. "Okay," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Okay." Nicholas crossed the room and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into a tight embrace. Sophie sank into him, finally allowing herself to cry, to release the pain she had been holding onto for so long. Ava joined them, wrapping her arms around both of them, and for the first time in what felt like forever, they stood together as a family, broken, messy, but together. That night, the three of them sat around the dinner table, the tension that had once filled the house replaced with a fragile but real sense of hope. The conversation was light, tentative, as though they were all still finding their way, but there was a new sense of openness between them. Nicholas watched his daughters, laugh together, a small, cautious smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The road ahead would not be easy. There were still so many questions, so much pain to work through. But for the first time in a long time, Nicholas felt that they had a chance to heal. A real chance. After dinner, as they sat in the living room, Sophie turned to Nicholas, her voice soft but steady. "I want to know more. About you, about my mother. About everything." Nicholas nodded, his heart swelling with emotion. "I'll tell you everything you want to know. I promise." And for the first time, as Sophie looked at him, Nicholas saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. trust. As they sat together, talking late into the night, the fractured pieces of their past began to mend, one story at a time. They were far from perfect, far from whole, but they were a family now, and that was enough to begin again. In the weeks that followed Sophie's return, life inside the Hayes household began to feel, for the first time in what felt like years, a little bit normal. It wasn't an easy road, far from it. Every day came with its challenges, each of them navigating the fragile new reality of their relationship. But with each shared meal, each conversation, Nicholas could feel the threads of their family slowly knitting back together. Sophie was still reserved, cautious even, but there was a warmth to her now that hadn't been there before. She no longer wore the mask of calm detachment she had carried for so long. Instead, she allowed herself to be vulnerable, to show her emotions, not all at once, but in small, delicate steps. For Ava, Sophie's presence had become a source of comfort again. Knowing that Sophie was her sister had shaken Ava at first, but the bond they had built before the truth had come out seemed to anchor them both. They spent more time together, talking about trivial things, movies, books, school, but also slowly venturing into deeper, more difficult topics. One afternoon, Nicholas found them sitting on the porch, sharing an old blanket as they watched the rain pour down over the yard. Ava was laughing at something Sophie had said, her face bright and open in a way Nicholas hadn't seen in a long time. It filled him with a sense of peace, something he had nearly forgotten how to feel. But despite the progress, there was still a distance between him and Sophie. It wasn't as raw as it had been before, but it was there, hovering in the space between them, unspoken. Nicholas understood. Sophie had been hurt by the truth, by the years lost between them, and healing that wound would take time. One evening, after Ava had gone to bed, Nicholas and Sophie found themselves alone in the kitchen. The quiet hum of the refrigerator filled the silence between them as Sophie absent-mindedly washed dishes at the sink. Nicholas sat at the table, watching her for a moment, trying to find the right words to say. "I'm proud of you, you know," Nicholas said softly, breaking the silence. His voice was low, tentative. Sophie paused, glancing over her shoulder at him, her brow furrowing slightly. "Proud of me?" she repeated, as though the words didn't quite make sense. He nodded, his gaze steady. "For everything. For coming back. For giving this a chance." Sophie's expression softened, but there was still a guardedness in her eyes. She turned back to the sink, rinsing off the last of the plates before drying her hands. "I didn't think I would," she admitted quietly. "I didn't think I could." Nicholas stood up from the table, crossing the room to stand beside her. He leaned against the counter, close but not intruding on her space. "I'm glad you did," he said sincerely. "It means everything to me, and to Ava." Sophie was quiet for a long moment, her hands twisting the towel in her grip. "It's still hard," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I spent so many years wondering why I was given up, why I didn't belong to anyone. And then to find out like this, it's a lot." Nicholas's heart ached at her words. He had been so focused on his own guilt, his own feelings of failure, that he hadn't fully considered how deeply Sophie had been affected by the absence of knowing where she came from. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I wish I could take those years back. I wish I could have been there for you from the beginning." Sophie looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "It's not your fault," she said softly. "You didn't know. And I'm not angry at you, not anymore. I'm just trying to figure out what comes next." Nicholas nodded, understanding her struggle. He had been asking himself the same question. What comes next? How do they move forward from here, with so much history between them and so much unknown ahead? "I want to be your father," Nicholas said gently. "I know I can't make up for the time we lost, but I want to be here for you now, if you'll let me." Sophie's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, her guard slipping for just a moment. She blinked them away, taking a deep breath before she nodded. "I want that too," she whispered. I don't know how to do it." Nicholas reached out, taking her hand in his. "We'll figure it out," he promised. "One day at a time. No pressure. Just being there for each other." Sophie squeezed his hand, a small but significant gesture, and Nicholas felt a swell of hope in his chest. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was a start, and that was enough. As the days turned into weeks, the family began to settle into a new rhythm. There were still moments of awkwardness, still moments where the weight of everything that had happened lingered between them, but there was also laughter. There were small moments of joy, shared in quiet conversations and simple gestures that felt like healing. Ava, ever perceptive, had noticed the growing bond between Sophie and Nicholas. She had once been the one to pull them together, but now she was content to sit back and watch as they found their way. It was a relief for her, knowing that Sophie was no longer on the outside, but a real part of their family. One evening, as they all sat together watching a movie, Ava curled up next to Sophie on the couch, her head resting on her shoulder. Nicholas sat in the armchair across from them, his eyes lingering on the two of them, his daughters. The sight filled him with a sense of peace, a quiet contentment that he hadn't felt in years. Halfway through the movie, Sophie turned to him, her voice soft. "Tell me about her," she said. Nicholas's heart skipped a beat. He knew exactly what Sophie was asking. She wanted to know about her mother, about Isabella. For a moment, the old ache resurfaced, the grief of a love lost, and the pain of never knowing the child that had come from it. But he pushed it aside, knowing that this was a conversation they needed to have. "She was complicated," Nicholas began, his voice thoughtful, "but she was also kind and funny and stubborn in all the best ways." Sophie listened intently, her eyes focused on Nicholas as he spoke. Ava, too, listened quietly, curious to learn more about this woman who had unknowingly connected them all. Nicholas told them stories of his brief time with Isabella, how they had met, how they had fallen in love quickly, and how life had pulled them apart just as suddenly. He spoke of the regret he had carried for years, wondering what had happened to her after they lost touch, never knowing that she had been pregnant. As he spoke, he saw the emotions flicker across Sophie's face. The pain of not knowing her mother, the sadness of the lost years, but also something else. A sense of belonging, perhaps, or maybe just the quiet realization that she wasn't alone in carrying that pain. When he finished, there was a long silence. Sophie's eyes were filled with tears, but she didn't cry. Instead, she reached out and took Nicholas's hand, her grip firm and steady. "Thank you," she whispered. Nicholas nodded, his own eyes misty. "I wish I had known her longer," he said quietly. "But I see so much of her in you, Sophie, and I'm grateful for that." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the past no longer as heavy, the bonds between them growing stronger with each passing day. As the night drew to a close and the house grew quiet again, Nicholas stood at the window, looking out at the moonlit yard. He felt a deep sense of gratitude, of hope for the future. The road ahead would still be difficult, but they were moving forward. Slowly, carefully, they were becoming a family. And for the first time, Nicholas believed that they could heal, not just from the wounds of the past, but from the pain of all the years lost. Together, they would find their way, one step at a time. Weeks passed, and the house that once held so much pain began to feel like home again. It wasn't just the house that had changed, it was them. Nicholas, Sophie, and Ava, once separated by silence, guilt, and unspoken truths, had begun to form a real bond. The kind of bond that could only be forged through struggle and vulnerability. Sophie, who had spent most of her life searching for a place where she truly belonged, now found herself looking forward to the quiet moments she shared with her father and sister. It still felt strange sometimes, this new reality of being part of a family she had never known existed, but it was a good kind of strange, the kind that made her feel like she was finally stepping into something real, something she had never let herself believe she deserved. One morning, as sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, the three of them sat together at the table. It was a simple scene. Ava laughing as she tried to cook breakfast, Nicholas attempting to help and mostly getting in the way, while Sophie watched with an amused smile. "Dad, you're going to burn the eggs," Ava scolded playfully, grabbing the spatula from his hands and shooing him away from the stove. Nicholas held up his hands in surrender, laughing. All right, I'll leave the cooking to the professionals. Sophie chuckled from her seat, watching the exchange with a warmth in her chest she hadn't expected. It felt so natural now, being here with them. The awkwardness that had once filled the house was gone, replaced by something lighter, something hopeful. As they settled down for breakfast, the conversation flowed easily. Ava talked about school, about her friends, and Sophie chimed in with stories from her own teenage years, earning a few laughs from Ava and Nicholas alike. For once, the weight of the past didn't hang over them like a shadow. It was still there, of course. Sophie and Nicholas hadn't forgotten the years they had lost, but they were no longer defined by it. After breakfast, Nicholas found himself alone in the living room, sipping coffee as he gazed out the window. Sophie had gone outside with Ava, their laughter echoing from the backyard. He watched them for a moment, feeling a deep sense of peace settle over him. The guilt he had carried for so long had begun to lift, replaced by something far more powerful: gratitude. He hadn't expected any of this. He hadn't expected to find Sophie again, hadn't expected to rebuild his relationship with Ava. But somehow, against all odds, they had come together. And as he watched his daughters, talking and laughing in the backyard, he knew that this was what he had always wanted, even if he hadn't known it until now. The front door opened, and Sophie stepped inside. Her cheeks flushed from the cool autumn air. She paused when she saw Nicholas standing there, the look in his eyes soft but thoughtful. "You all right?" she asked, crossing the room to stand beside him. Nicholas smiled, nodding. "More than all right." Sophie gave him a curious look, waiting for him to elaborate. "I've been thinking," he said, setting down his coffee cup, "about everything we've been through, about where we are now." Sophie nodded, her expression softening. "It's been a long road." Nicholas looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pride and affection. "It has. But we made it. And I'm proud of you, Sophie. For all of it. For the strength you've shown. For the way you've let yourself be part of this family. I'm proud to be your father." Sophie's breath caught in her throat at his words. She had never heard him say it quite like that before, and it hit her harder than she expected. For so long, she had kept herself at a distance, afraid to let anyone in, afraid to trust that this was real. But hearing him say those words, hearing him call her his daughter, made it feel real in a way that nothing else had. "I'm proud of you too," Sophie whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "for not giving up, for fighting to be a part of my life, even when it was hard." Nicholas smiled, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We've got a lot of time to make up for, Sophie, but I'm here for all of it. Every day, every step." Sophie nodded, her heart swelling with emotion. She reached out and hugged him, and this time, it wasn't the tentative embrace of two people still figuring out where they stood. It was the hug of a daughter and her father, a connection that had been long overdue but was finally real. As they pulled apart, Ava stepped into the room, her face bright with excitement. "You guys need to come outside," she exclaimed, practically bouncing on her feet. "There's something I want to show you." Nicholas and Sophie exchanged amused glances before following Ava outside. She led them to the far end of the backyard, where a small tree had been planted near the fence. "I thought we could plant something together," Ava explained, beaming with pride. "A new tree for a new beginning." Nicholas smiled, feeling a swell of pride for his daughter. Ava had been through so much, losing her mother, dealing with her grief, and now navigating this new chapter with Sophie. But here she was, stronger than ever, offering a symbol of growth and hope. "I love it," Sophie said, her voice soft but filled with warmth. "It's perfect." Together, they stood there, looking at the small tree, its leaves fluttering gently in the breeze. It was a simple thing, but it felt like the perfect symbol of where they were now. A new beginning, a fresh start. Nicholas wrapped his arms around his daughters, pulling them close. "I think this is the start of something really good," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Ava leaned into him, her eyes bright with happiness. "Me too," Sophie smiled, resting her head on Nicholas's shoulder. "We're going to be okay," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. But the words felt right, felt true. For the first time in a long time, They all believed it. As the weeks turned into months, the tree in the backyard grew stronger, its roots sinking deeper into the earth. And just like the tree, their family grew stronger too, each day a little better than the last. Nicholas, Sophie, and Ava had learned that healing wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about accepting it, learning from it, and moving forward together. They weren't perfect, and there were still moments of difficulty, but they faced them together now, as a family. And that, more than anything, was what mattered. In the end, they had found their way, not because they had erased the pain of the past, but because they had chosen to grow through it, together. And as they stood beneath the shade of the growing tree, they knew that no matter what came next, they would face it side by side, with love and hope guiding them forward. 6 months had passed since that day under the tree, and life had settled into a new rhythm for Nicholas, Sophie, and Ava. The past still lingered, as it always would, but it no longer held the same weight. They had found a way to move forward, together, but there were still lingering questions, pieces of their story that hadn't fully come to light. Questions that, until now, had remained unanswered. One evening, Sophie sat in her room, an old box of letters on her bed. She had found them tucked away in her mother's things, letters that Isabella had written but never sent. Sophie had avoided opening them for weeks, unsure of whether she was ready to face the last remaining pieces of her mother's past. But tonight felt different. She was ready. She unfolded the first letter carefully, her hands trembling slightly. The handwriting was familiar, her mother's script, flowing and delicate, filled with the emotion that Isabella had never been able to fully express in words. Dear Nicholas, I'm writing this letter because I owe you the truth. I should have told you years ago, but by the time I found out, it was already too late. I was pregnant, Nicholas. I found out after we had parted ways, after we had gone our separate paths. I told myself I could handle it on my own, that you didn't need to be involved. I was wrong. I gave birth to a beautiful girl. I named her Sophie. I wanted to tell you. I really did. But life had become too complicated, and I was afraid. Afraid of how you'd react, afraid of what it would mean for us. So I kept her a secret. I told myself it was for the best, that I was protecting you. But the truth is, I was protecting myself. I didn't want to face what we had lost. I thought I could be enough for her. I thought I could raise her alone. But as the years passed, I realized how wrong I was. She deserved to know you, to know where she came from. But by then, too much time had passed, and I didn't know how to go back. I didn't know how to fix the mess I had created. So I'm writing this now, knowing it may never reach you, but hoping that somehow, someday, Sophie will find her way to you. She deserves to know her father. And you deserve to know your daughter. I'm sorry, Nicholas. I'm sorry for all of it. With love, Isabella. Sophie set the letter down, her hands trembling. Her mother's words were heavy with regret, with the pain of secrets kept for too long. But there was something else in the letter, too. Something that Sophie hadn't expected to find. There was love. Despite everything, despite the distance and the silence, her mother had loved her. And in her own flawed way, Isabella had tried to do what she thought was best. Sophie took a deep breath, her heart aching with the weight of everything she had just learned. Her mother's decision to keep her a secret had shaped so much of her life. But now, reading these words, Sophie finally understood. It hadn't been out of malice or selfishness, it had been out of fear. Fear of losing what little control Isabella had left over her life. The next morning, Sophie shared the letter with Nicholas. They sat together in the living room, the letter between them, the silence heavy but not uncomfortable. Nicholas read the letter slowly, his face a mask of quiet pain as he absorbed his old love's words. When he finished, he set the letter down and looked at Sophie, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. I wish I had known, he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. I wish she had told me. Sophie nodded, understanding his pain all too well. She thought she was doing the right thing, she said quietly. But I think she regretted it. Nicholas let out a long, weary sigh. I would have been there, you know? I would have been there for you, for her. I know, Sophie said, her voice soft but steady. And I think she knew that too in the end. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the past between them. But there was no anger, no bitterness, just a shared sadness for the years they had lost, and for the woman they had both loved in different ways. Over the next few weeks, Sophie continued to explore her mother's letters, uncovering pieces of the past that had been hidden for so long. She learned more about her mother's struggles, how Isabella had fought to keep her head above water as a single mother, how she had wrestled with the decision to give Sophie up for adoption when things became too difficult to manage. It wasn't an easy story to hear, but it gave Sophie the closure she needed. As for Nicholas, the letters provided a kind of peace he hadn't known he needed. He had spent so many years wondering why Isabella had disappeared from his life, why she had never told him about Sophie. Now, with her words in his hands, he could finally let go of the anger, the regret, and focus on the future. The future he still had with Sophie and Ava. One evening, as they sat together in the backyard, Sophie looked at Nicholas and smiled. A real, genuine smile. "I think I understand her now," Sophie said, her voice soft but filled with a quiet strength. "I don't agree with everything she did, but I understand why she made the choices she did." Nicholas nodded, his heart full. "I'm glad you have that understanding," he said, "and I'm glad we have this chance to start fresh." Sophie smiled again, a small, contented smile. "Me too." In the months that followed, the Hayes family continued to grow stronger. The tree that Ava had planted in the backyard flourished, its branches reaching higher into the sky with each passing day. It became a symbol for them, a symbol of growth, of healing, and of new beginnings. And while they would never forget the pain of the past, they no longer let it define them. Instead, they chose to focus on the future, a future that, for the first time, felt full of possibility. As Sophie looked out at the tree one evening, the setting sun casting a warm glow over the yard, she felt a deep sense of peace. She wasn't just the girl searching for answers anymore. She wasn't the orphan who didn't know where she belonged. She was Sophie Hayes, daughter of Nicholas, sister of Ava. And that was enough. For all of them, they had found their way home.